They were looking for a spy they had never seen. Across occupied France, German officers circulated descriptions that felt strangely incomplete. The woman they were hunting didn't fit the image of an enemy agent. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't travel with soldiers. She walked with a limp. And yet, inside Gestapo offices, her name kept appearing. Reports linked her to disappearing pilots, to resistance cells that collapsed only after she had already vanished, to messages that reached London despite entire networks being shut down. Each time something went wrong for the Germans, she seemed to have been there shortly before. No one understood how. At first, they assumed she was a rumor, a story the resistance told to boost morale. But as arrests increased and still failed to stop the leaks, the tone changed. Orders became sharper. Questions became urgent. Someone was moving through their territory freely, and she wasn't hiding. What made it worse was how ordinary she seemed. Witnesses described a woman who blended into crowds, who moved slowly, who didn't attract attention. A woman who, by all appearances, should have been easy to stop. But she never was. At the time, German intelligence believed danger looked a certain way. It looked armed. It looked young. It looked fast. This woman looked none of those things. That assumption would cost them. As the months passed, the Gestapo gave her a designation that few agents ever received. Not a code number, not a vague alias. They called her the most dangerous Allied spy in France. No explanation followed, just the name. The contradiction was unsettling. How could a woman who limped through occupied streets outrun an entire intelligence apparatus? How could someone so visible remain unreachable? No report ever answered that question. Instead, the files grew thicker. Every failed operation added to her shadow. Every captured courier who refused to talk somehow strengthened her reputation. And every time German officers believed they had finally cornered her, she slipped away again, often passing directly through checkpoints she had no right to cross. At the time, they believed her escapes were luck. They were wrong. What they didn't realize, what none of them considered, was that the very thing they dismissed as a weakness was shaping every successful move she made, because she wasn't avoiding attention. She was using it. The limp slowed her down. Yes, but it also lowered expectations. Guards searched bags more thoroughly than they searched her. Papers were checked, but bodies were waved through. No one thought to question a woman who appeared already burdened, and that blind spot followed her everywhere. Still, the Gestapo was closing in. By the end of the year, her routes were compromised. Safe houses were raided. Names began surfacing under interrogation. And for the first time, there were signs that someone had noticed a pattern. Not who she was, but what she carried. That realization came too late, because by then, she had already moved again, crossing borders, slipping through cracks, carrying something no one thought to search, something that didn't look like a weapon, something that shouldn't have mattered, and yet it would become the reason she stayed free. What the Gestapo didn't know, what no one watching her walk away could have guessed, was that the object slowing her steps was also the most dangerous thing she possessed, and the war was only just beginning for her. Long before the Gestapo ever wrote her name down, Virginia Hall had already been told her career was over. It didn't happen during a mission. There was no enemy, no gunfire, no dramatic escape. It happened quietly during a hunting trip in Turkey. One careless moment, one misstep, and a bullet that shattered her lower leg beyond repair. By the time doctors finished examining the damage, there was no debate. The leg would have to be amputated below the knee. For most people, That would have been the end of the story. For someone hoping to work in intelligence, a field that demanded movement, stamina, and invisibility, it should have closed every door permanently. Intelligence agencies did not recruit people who limped. They did not send agents who needed assistance. They certainly did not trust someone who could not run. At least, that was the assumption. Virginia Hall woke from surgery to a future that had already been decided for her. Officials were polite but firm. She was advised to lower her expectations, to accept a desk role, to be realistic. At the time, no one thought they were being cruel. They thought they were being practical. Her prosthetic leg was functional but crude, a heavy wooden device with limited flexibility. Walking required effort. Balance had to be relearned. Pain became constant, not dramatic, but persistent. It slowed her down, and everyone around her saw only that. What they didn't see, what they couldn't measure, was how the injury changed the way people looked at her, how assumptions formed instantly, how conversations shifted, how attention drifted away from her the moment her limp became noticeable. At first, even Virginia believed the same thing they did. She tried to re-enter service through official channels and was quietly rejected, not because of her intelligence or her language skills or her understanding of Europe, but because of the leg. That rejection mattered, because it forced her to consider something no one else had. If she could no longer fit the image of a spy, then perhaps she could become something else entirely. At the time, she didn't yet know what that would mean. She named the wooden leg Cuthbert, partly as a joke, partly to take control of something that had been imposed on her. Humor helped. So did stubbornness. She learned to walk long distances, despite the pain. She practiced until the limp looked natural, unforced, until it became part of her. That detail would matter later. When war broke out across Europe, Virginia Hall was not on any list of ideal recruits, but she was watching closely as intelligence agencies scrambled, relaxed rules, and made exceptions they once swore they never would. And quietly, doors began to open again. Not because the injury no longer mattered, but because war had a way of redefining usefulness. British intelligence saw something others hadn't. Hall spoke fluent French. She understood European cities not as maps, but as living systems. She could blend in. And most importantly, she had already learned how to move unnoticed. Her disability disqualified her on paper. In reality, it made her invisible. Still, even those who approved her never imagined the wooden leg would become anything more than an inconvenience. No one suggested it might help her hide. No one thought it could be useful. Not yet, because at that stage, the leg was still just a reminder of what she had lost: speed, ease, acceptance. What no one realized, not her handlers, not her superiors, not even Virginia herself, was that the object everyone saw as a limitation would eventually become the safest place she could hide the most dangerous things she carried. That transformation wouldn't happen immediately. It would happen slowly, through necessity, through inspection, through moments when guards searched everything except the one thing they believed had already taken enough from her. And by the time anyone thought to reconsider that assumption, it would be far too late, because Virginia Hall was about to enter occupied Europe, and the leg they dismissed as a weakness was about to follow her everywhere. When Virginia Hall crossed into occupied France, there was nothing dramatic about her arrival. No gunfire, no pursuit, no last-minute escape. She entered the way thousands of others did, quietly, cautiously, carrying papers that would be glanced at and returned. To the soldiers watching the border crossings, she was just another civilian, navigating a continent at war. She moved slowly. She limped. She waited patiently when lines stalled. No one rushed her, and that was the point. From the moment she arrived, Virginia understood something essential. Speed drew attention. Efficiency raised suspicion. Confidence invited scrutiny. She did none of those things. She moved deliberately. She allowed guards to grow bored with her presence. They always did. At the time, the Germans were overwhelmed. Occupied France was vast. Resistance networks were spreading, and intelligence officers were trained to look for patterns. Men of fighting age, travelers who moved too often, people who avoided inspection. Virginia Hall fit none of those profiles. She rented rooms that felt temporary. She worked odd jobs. She spoke French with the ease of someone who belonged. And everywhere she went, she observed. Slowly, carefully, she began building something invisible. Safe houses came first, then contacts, then routes, not lines on a map, but rhythms of daily life. Which guards changed shifts when? Which streets were watched only at night? Which cafes attracted soldiers who talked too freely after drinking? At first, her messages were small. Names, observations, fragments of information that seemed harmless on their own, but they traveled far. And once they reached London, they were combined with other fragments, enough to matter. The danger escalated quietly. Allied pilots began disappearing from crash sites and reappearing across borders. Resistance cells coordinated without ever meeting. Trains were delayed. Shipments went missing. And every time German authorities tried to trace the source, the trail dissolved. Still, no one suspected the woman with the limp. What they didn't see was how close she came to discovery. Again and again. Checkpoints became more frequent. Random inspections increased. Bags were searched. Coats were patted down. Rooms were turned upside down with clinical precision. Virginia stood through it all, calm and cooperative. She learned how to look harmless under scrutiny, how to respond with irritation instead of fear, how to let officials search everything she carried without appearing defensive. That detail mattered, because while they searched her belongings, they never searched her. The wooden leg drew glances, not hands. Curiosity, not suspicion. It marked her as already compromised, already limited, already accounted for. At the time, even Virginia didn't fully grasp how powerful that blind spot was. But the pressure was increasing. By 1942, arrests spread across the resistance network. People disappeared overnight. Names surfaced under interrogation. Radios were confiscated. Entire communication lines collapsed without warning. Virginia adjusted constantly. She moved contacts, changed routines, burned addresses, and rebuilt them elsewhere. Each adaptation kept her alive, but narrowed her margin for error. Then came the moment she knew things had changed. A German officer looked at her longer than usual. It wasn't suspicion. Not yet. It was calculation. From that point on, patrols seemed closer. Searches felt more deliberate. The sense of anonymity she had relied on began to fray at the edges. The Gestapo didn't know who she was, but they knew someone like her existed, and that was enough. What they still didn't know, what no one imagined, was how much she carried with her every time she crossed a street or passed through a checkpoint. How much information moved where she moved. How much depended on the thing they never searched. The leg was still just a leg to them. To Virginia, it was becoming something else. A hiding place, a shield, a constant companion that went wherever she went and drew no suspicion at all. That realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, during inspections that ended too quickly, during moments when guards waved her through without touching her. During searches where every pocket was emptied and the leg was ignored, those moments added up. And slowly, Virginia Hall began to understand something terrifying and useful. The safest place to hide something was not where no one could find it. It was where no one would ever think to look. That understanding would soon change everything about how she operated, and it would make her more dangerous than the Gestapo ever imagined. The moment Virginia Hall realized what the wooden leg could do, there was no going back. It didn't begin with a plan. It began with necessity. By late 1942, occupied France had become far more dangerous. The Gestapo was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. Radios were traced faster. Couriers vanished mid-route. Entire resistance cells collapsed in days instead of weeks. The margin for error was gone. Carrying documents in bags was no longer safe. Hiding codes in clothing became reckless. Even memorization had limits. One arrest, one beating, and information could be forced out. Virginia needed a place no one would search. And then she noticed what kept happening. During inspections, soldiers were methodical. They emptied her pockets, they opened packages, they shook bags. Sometimes they even searched her hair or shoes. But they never touched the leg, not once. It wasn't pity, it was assumption. The wooden prosthetic marked her as finished, damaged, already punished. Guards glanced at it and looked away. Some were uncomfortable, others were bored. None were curious. That pattern repeated itself too many times to ignore. So she tested it. At first, she hid something small, a folded note, a single code phrase, nothing that would end her mission if discovered. She passed through checkpoints deliberately, letting inspections happen. Nothing changed. No questions, no delay, no suspicion. That was the moment the leg stopped being a limitation and became a container. Virginia began modifying the prosthetic carefully, methodically, hollowing sections, creating compartments that could be opened and resealed without visible change. Everything had to feel natural, solid, unquestionable. The leg had to remain invisible in plain sight. Soon, it carried more than notes. Microfilm, coded messages, contact lists, instructions meant for multiple resistance cells, items that, if found, would have resulted in immediate execution. Each time she moved, the most dangerous objects in her possession were attached directly to her body, impossible to separate from her without force. And no one ever tried. What made it even more effective was how she behaved. She never protected the leg, never adjusted it nervously, never reacted when guards looked at it. She treated it the way they did, as if it didn't matter. Meanwhile, her operations expanded. She coordinated drops, organized escapes, redirected agents. Messages moved faster and safer than before. The Gestapo noticed the results, not the method. They responded with more arrests, harsher interrogations, and tighter surveillance. Entire districts were locked down. Papers were scrutinized. Movement became dangerous even in daylight. Still, Virginia moved. Every step was a risk. Every inspection carried the possibility of discovery. If someone ever touched the leg, really examined it, there would be no explanation, no excuse. At that stage, even she didn't know what would happen if the secret was exposed. She only knew that it hadn't been yet. What the Gestapo failed to understand was that their system was built on expectation. They searched where danger usually lived. They ignored what didn't fit their model. Virginia Hall lived entirely outside that model, and the leg made sure of it. But success always leaves traces. By the time German intelligence realized a single agent was coordinating far more than they believed possible, It was too late to stop her quietly. Orders were issued. A profile was developed. A warning circulated. They still didn't know about the leg, but they knew they were dealing with something exceptional. Soon, her name would no longer be a rumor. Soon, the hunt would become personal. And when that happened, even the wooden leg might not be enough to save her. The moment the Gestapo learned her name, everything changed. Until then, Virginia Hall had been a problem, an invisible one, a disruption without a face, a network without a center. But once intelligence officers began connecting reports, once patterns aligned across regions, they stopped chasing shadows. They started hunting a person. Her description circulated quickly. An American woman, fluent French, operated alone, moved constantly, and most importantly, she walked with a limp. That detail, once dismissed, suddenly became unmistakable. Posters went up. Checkpoints received updated instructions. Officers were told to watch for a woman who looked harmless and moved slowly because that was exactly how she avoided detection. The danger escalated overnight. Virginia felt it before she saw it. Guards watched longer. Questions lasted a little too long. Patrols appeared where they hadn't been before. Routes she had used for months were suddenly compromised. Someone had talked. She didn't know who. She didn't know when. She only knew she no longer had the luxury of testing her luck. For the first time since arriving in occupied Europe, Virginia was being hunted specifically. The Gestapo issued a direct order for her capture, not interrogation. Capture. She learned of it indirectly, through whispers passed across resistance lines. A single sentence repeated itself wherever she went. They know who you are. From that moment on, there was no safe place. Safe houses were abandoned before dawn. Meetings were cancelled minutes before they were meant to happen. Contacts disappeared without explanation. Each decision had to be made faster, with less information. And through it all, the wooden leg remained attached to her body, heavier now, more dangerous than ever. Carrying it meant carrying proof. If she was caught, there would be no misunderstanding, no chance of being dismissed as a civilian. Everything she was, everything she had done, was inside that leg. The Gestapo came closest to capturing her during what should have been a routine movement, a checkpoint she had passed through before. Papers prepared, story rehearsed. This time, an officer hesitated. He looked at her face, then at her leg, then back again. The pause lasted seconds. It felt like minutes. Virginia didn't rush. She didn't argue. She shifted her weight, grimaced slightly, and waited. The gesture was practiced. The discomfort, real enough to be convincing. Finally, the officer waved her through. She walked away, knowing something fundamental had changed. The net was tightening. Within days, her network collapsed almost entirely. Arrests followed arrests. Streets became traps. Her presence alone endangered anyone she contacted. There was only one option left. She had to leave. The escape route out of France was brutal. Mountain passes, winter conditions, patrols that shot first and questioned later. For able-bodied couriers, it was deadly. For someone with a wooden leg, it should have been impossible. Virginia moved anyway. Each step was agony. The terrain punished every miscalculation. The prosthetics slipped, bruised, cut into flesh, already worn raw. Stopping wasn't an option. Neither was slowing down. At times, she crawled. At others, she was carried. What kept her moving wasn't strength. It was urgency. Behind her, the Gestapo continued searching, convinced they were close. Ahead of her, borders offered no guarantee of safety, and still, the leg stayed with her. Not abandoned, not hidden, not removed, because without it, she would be exposed in ways she couldn't afford. When she finally crossed out of occupied territory, she didn't celebrate. There was no relief, no sense of victory, only exhaustion. The Gestapo never caught her, but they never stopped looking. Even after she vanished from their reach, orders bearing her name remained active. Files stayed open. Warnings stayed in circulation. She had escaped, but the hunt hadn't ended, and the wooden leg, the object that had carried her through the most dangerous phase of her life, would follow her into the next one. Because Virginia Hall was not finished, and neither was the war. When Virginia Hall returned to Allied control, there was no parade waiting for her, no headlines, no public recognition, no official acknowledgement of what she had survived, or how close she had come to disappearing forever. That silence was intentional. Spies didn't get celebrated, they got reassigned. Within months, Virginia was back at work, this time under a different organization, in a different role, with the same quiet determination. The wooden leg remained with her, repaired and modified again, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of what had already been possible. The Gestapo, meanwhile, never closed her file. Even after she escaped France, German intelligence continued circulating her description. Her name appeared in reports long after she was gone. She had become something rare in wartime intelligence, a personal failure the system couldn't correct. And that mattered, because intelligence agencies don't fear individuals who follow patterns. They fear the ones who break them. Virginia Hall had done exactly that. She had operated alone when networks were expected. She had moved slowly when speed was assumed. She had carried secrets in a place no one thought to search, and she had turned an apparent weakness into her greatest protection. After the war, recognition came, quietly. Medals were awarded in rooms without cameras. Commendations were delivered without speeches. Even then, many details of her work remained classified for decades. When asked about her service, Virginia rarely spoke about danger. She didn't describe heroism. She didn't dramatize survival. She treated it as work. That restraint made her story easier to forget. There were no iconic photographs, no single battle to point to, no moment frozen in popular memory. Just years of movement, pressure, risk, and restraint, and a wooden leg that carried more than anyone ever knew. History prefers clean narratives, soldiers with rifles, battles with names, victories with dates. Virginia Hall didn't fit any of those categories. She moved through margins, through assumptions, through blind spots built into power itself. And that may be why her story matters now more than ever, because it forces a question that war stories rarely ask. How many people changed history not by overpowering systems, but by understanding them better than anyone else? The Gestapo never caught her, not because they weren't thorough, but because they were certain they knew what danger looked like, and Virginia Hall never looked the part.